Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today we're going to be going over some watercolor basics. First, let's go over some of the supplies that you're going to need in order to be successful at watercoloring. You can fudge some of these supplies if you don't have all of them, that's fine, but here's my recommendation. The first is some sort of a hard board. This could be wood, it can be the back of an old sketch pad, cardboard, foam board, just something hard that you can attach your watercolor paper. And specifically, you want to get at least 140-pound watercolor paper. If you see watercolor paper that's 110-pound, that's not enough. I think that's a ripoff. You'll also need some masking tape. You'll want 2 cups of water, one with clean water and one with dirty water. I try to put my dirty water to the front near me. A towel, paper towel, rag, anything like that. A watercolor brush. I recommend using a size 8, 10, or 12. You really only need one. A pencil, a pipette, or some way to distribute water in a controlled manner, maybe a little measuring cup, something like that. A palette. It doesn't need to be an official art palette. You could use something like ice cube trays. You could even save old yogurt containers, something like that, but you need something to mix your colors in. Then you obviously need some watercolors. I prefer to use tube watercolors. They come out in a semi-liquid form, but you might have watercolors that come in little pots and are dried. I'm going to show you how to use both of these. The final thing that is very helpful in watercolor is having a hairdryer. We'll go over how to use this in a little bit. I'll put a bulleted supply list in the description. I do have a linked supply list on my website on rebelunicorncrafts.com. However, right now supplies are low and it's not guaranteed that anything I link is going to be available. So use the list as a guideline for what you can get. Okay, let's discuss the first step you want to take as well as your general setup. So the first thing you want to do is tape down your piece of paper flat, and you want to make sure all edges are nice and covered. I like to tape mine in about 1/4 of an inch in and try to keep it parallel to the edge, so when I pull it up it looks really nice if we paint all the way to the lines. This is going to prevent your paper from buckling. It also makes it so it doesn't move around, so it's easier to work on, and it adds a nice little border to it. Let's quickly go over the setup. Your setup will depend on if you are right or left-handed. I am right-handed, so I put all of my supplies and anything that's going to be wet over to the right. I don't currently have my paints in the right spot because I haven't gotten started, as well as I'm going to be showing 2 different ones. But if you're right-handed, put your paint palette, your towels, all of your brushes, and your water to the right, as well as your paints. If you are left-handed, place all of that to the left side. And this is crucial to make sure you don't drip things all over your piece of paper while you're working on it. A quick tip before we keep going, do not touch your paper with your fingers. That deposits oil onto the paper and it will make it so the water does not want to spread evenly. So try to avoid doing that as best as you can. Once you have everything set up and you're ready to start painting, the first thing you want to do is sketch it out. So figure out what you're going to be painting. I'm going to do a quick sketch of a feather here, and you want to draw lightly. If you draw really heavy-handed, it's going to show up underneath your final painting. When I've finished a sketch, I typically also lightly erase over it so it's even fainter. Now that we've done all of the busy work of setup, we get to move on to the fun part where we mix our colors. If you're using dried pots, you want to go ahead and reactivate all of your colors by re-wetting either with a brush or with a pipette. I like to use a pipette because I can keep my water clean. all of the colors that you're going to be adding. These need to sit for a minute to kind of reactivate the colors so you can actually grab a decent amount of each one. So just put a little water in the ones that you want to use and set it aside. If you're using tube paints, these actually go pretty far, so don't put a huge amount in to anything. You just want to, on the side of your palette, add a tiny little dollop of each color that you want to use. This is a tiny amount, it's not even a pea size. We can always add more if we need to, but just start with a little bit at a time. So you set all your colors out that you're going to be using to mix your colors. Put them on your palette. Since we're working with watercolors, we need to start with water. So we're going to take some clean water, and I'm going to use about a half of a pipette in here because I'm not mixing up a ton of color, but if you want more, you'd want to add more color as well as more pigment. And we add the water directly to the little pot. And you're going to want to have a scrap piece of paper to test your colors on, because they're going to appear different in that little pot than they actually do on the paper. So first I'm going to mix up kind of a light green blue, and I do that by taking a little bit of green and a little bit of blue and mixing it together, and then I test it on that piece of paper till I get the color that I want. You only want to put a little swipe of each color because you want to see it dry quickly, and you also want to make sure you preserve so you're not using too much paper for testing. Between colors, be sure to clean your brush off really well. Swirl it around in the dirty water and wipe it on your towel until it comes off clean. Now let's mix up a color using our dried pots that we had refreshed by adding some water. So again, we start by putting a little water, about a half of a pipette for what I'm mixing up, into one of the little wells. And then we go ahead and we take our clean brush and we go straight into the color we want. So I first go into a blue. And if I'm re-picking up more blue, I don't need to clean off my brush. I can go straight in there, but if I'm going to then pick up a green, I want to wash my brush off in between so that I don't contaminate the blue with the green. So you'll see I tested before I added the green. Now I'm going to add some green in there. And that's closer to the color that I wanted. I personally like to mix up all of the colors I initially intend on using before I actually start the painting so that I can get my color palette right and I'm kind of ready to go. If I need to mix up an additional color as I'm painting, I can of course do that, but you're going to want to mix up all your colors first, again repeating those steps of adding water to a pot, mixing the color, between dipping into different colors, you want to make sure to wash your brush off, and just go ahead and get all the colors that you want here. I'm going to get a couple blues, a slight purple, and a pinky type color for my feather because I just want it to be kind of fun colors. Once you have your colors mixed up, then it's time to actually start using the brush and starting to paint. This lesson isn't so much focused on how to paint a feather, it's going to more be examining how to use the brush and the general tips that you need to know for when you're painting anything with watercolor. Let's start by first examining our brush. You want to have a round tip watercolor brush, and this is good for a few reasons. One, it holds a lot of watercolor so that you can actually use a decent amount of paint. And it has both a thick and a thin end, so you can get very fine lines or a thicker brush stroke using one brush. Your watercolor brush is a versatile tool. You want to dip it into the paint, which is a little off screen, and wipe it off on the side just a little bit so that there's a decent amount of water in it, but not too much. And you can get a really thin line and a thick line by using different pressure by pushing on the brush. If you add too much water like that and you don't tap off your brush, you get these puddles that become unmanageable and hard to control on the paper. You want to have the right amount of water to be able to still see some of the paper through and for the water not to move around as you move the paper around. This is something that you'll have to practice at. It took me a while to get to know how much water to keep in my brush to tap on and off in order to have the appropriate amount, and you'll get better with it just with a little more practice. I'm going to start this painting by drawing my middle line with the paint or painting the middle line, and you'll see I use different pressures along that middle line all with one brush, and it's going to be one of my darker colors, and I'm going to build up some of the background details that the other layers will still see a little bit through, but will be very subtle once we build our other layers. So you might want to do a little bit of detail work to begin with. That's usually where I start. You can also start by blocking out a main color, but it really depends on how you like to work, and this will depend on what you're painting. For something like this, I'd recommend kind of declaring some of the detail areas first. You'll see here that my color was a little bit too dark initially, so I actually dipped my brush into the water directly to lighten that color so that it wasn't quite as saturated. Using watercolor can take a lot of patience because you need to dry the paper between layers. But there are a few things you can do to make it dry faster. One is you can use a hair dryer. I'm going to show you here, I've got too much. Notice there that as I blow on it, the water moves around. We want to make sure we don't have any puddles of water before we try to force dry this. So really, really, really dry your brush off. And then if you touch it to those puddles of water and dry in between, it will actually suck up some of the extra moisture so that you have it dry enough in order to go ahead and use the hair dryer to dry that layer. The first technique we used when we put watercolor on the paper was called a wet on dry technique. We were using wet watercolor on dry paper. Let's now explore a wet on wet technique. This is where we're going to pre-wet our paper. We want to really saturate the paper with water so that it is wet, but we don't want puddles. Again, I will go ahead and put water all over this, and then I will show you a trick when you hold it up to the light. What you want to look for is you want a sheen on the paper so that one, you can tell it's wet, and two, there's a slight sheen to the paper, but you don't want that water to be moving around. You don't want there to be puddles. If you put too much water on, you can either suck it up or you can let it wait. And then, once you have the right amount, you can go ahead and add color directly onto the wet parts of the paper. And you can see it spread out. Watch that again, how the paint initially spreads out along the pre-wetted areas of the paper. It also shows you the areas of paper that I didn't have wetted well enough. So you can either leave them as harsher lines or you can add a little water to your brush and then try to brush out those areas like I'm doing there in order to try to make it look a little more natural like the rest of it. Remember to dry between layers. You can add more than one color at a time, just make sure they're not going to be colors that will mix together to make an ugly color. So a purple and a pink set next to each other will mix nicely, but a red and a green will mix together to make kind of a meh brown color. So strategically place these and layer them on. Continue until you are happy with what you have. In order to not overwhelm you with too many techniques, this is where we're going to end this video with the exception of one final tip. I think I will do a follow-up video in which we will talk about doing gradients and washes as well as some other fun wet-on-wet techniques. But for now, I'm not going to show you the rest of the layers I put on here. I almost wish I would have left it at the point you see it now, but I'm going to show you my last little tip. If you're underwhelmed with the results of your watercolor painting, sometimes adding a little pen detail is very helpful. You need to make sure that this is completely dry before you add pen or it will bleed. I like to work with felt tip pens. So just add a few details around kind of the edges and where you want to emphasize things, and I find that to help a lot. I guess I wasn't quite done. I've got one more tip for you, and that's when you're removing your paper from your backing or whatever hardboard you're using, you want to release the adhesive on the tape by hitting it with the hairdryer and getting the heat to release that adhesive. Otherwise, it will tear your watercolor paper. I hope that helps in getting you started, and I will start working on a part 2. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. If you're local to Northern Colorado and would like to take a class, visit rebelunicorncrafts.com to see my class listings. If you'd just like to see what I'm up to, visit my Instagram at rebelunicorncrafts, or if you'd like to see my art, you can visit my other Instagram at LaceyWalkerArt. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a magically creative day.